So today we're continuing with kind of getting us up to the 1940s and talking about what's happening before World War II. Kind of what the major artistic styles and trends are, and especially focusing on what's happening in America, keeping in mind that when we look at the development of art. After World War II, there's this shift to the United States. In particular, there's this shift to New York City. So when we talk about the first major style post-war, post-1945, it's abstract expressionism, and that's coming out of New York City. So what we're doing here is kind of focusing on what's happening among American artists in that, especially in that decade before the war, before the 1940s. So where we left off last time was just starting to talk a little bit about Thomas Hart Benton. And Benton is hugely influential on artists in a number of ways. One of the things we talked about last time too was the WPA, or the Works Progress Administration, being a part of a whole host of programs known as collectively as the New Deal. This idea that it's a New Deal, for America, largely. A lot of those programs were work programs to put Americans back to work, and it also included artists and architects. And in the art, certainly there were sculptural, or sculptors who were part of the WPA program. But when people think about the WPA program, they tend to think more about painting, and in particular, they oftentimes think of Thomas Hart Benton because he becomes one of the really dominant artists and really influential in the sense that he was getting commissions for some really significant paintings, but also because artists were in a lot of ways emulating his style to the point that his particular style tends to be associated with the WPA in general. So there were a lot of artists who didn't, if you look at their careers overall, they didn't necessarily paint like Benton, but when they were a part of the WPA program, they did, because that really became the kind of the favored style. So if we look at a couple of examples, Cradling Wheat is a smaller painting. The image we see on the right, it's a detail from a larger mural called Building America Today. When we look at Benton's work, there's this kind of tension, or sort of like a balance between naturalism, the realistic details, but then also abstraction as well, because the forms and the images that you see tend to be kind of simplified, but they're sometimes a little bit expressionistic, sort of all at the same time. But it's light, or it's pretty subtle, especially compared to what's going on in Europe. If we want to, in this case, compare American styles to European styles. And we can also talk about this influence on art even, really close to home as well. If you've been in the post office in Montevallo, there's a WPA mural. How many of you have been in the post office? How many of you have noticed the mural? Okay. Sometimes, a lot of times people will go, there's a mural, because it's above your head. You don't always look up, or you've seen it but haven't really paid a lot of attention to it. It's painted by an artist from Florida named William S. McCall, and it's supposed to depict early settlers in the Montevallo area. And when you look at this painting, you can see the influence of Benton. There's a similarity in the kind of these sort of generalized kind of similarities. The other thing about Benton is that he was very conservative, and he was really, really critical of European modernist trends. There's a seat up here in the middle. There's one if you want to. Yeah, right here in the very front. Sorry, and there's also one in the middle, right, too. I'm just on the floor. So he's very conservative, really critical of European style modernism, which is kind of interesting because when you look at his early career, what he was doing in the 1910s and the 1920s is he traveled to Europe, he spent time in Paris, and he was painting like a European modernist. And you look at that early work, and it really looks kind of Hugo futurist, or really like maybe Orphism, lots of colored, dynamic abstract forms. But what happens in the later 20s and through the 1930s, he really shifts away from that. He sees that as being a part of European culture, European attitudes, and not necessarily intrinsically American, and he moves toward this much more realistic style. And then as he becomes a part of the WPA, he really, again, sort of defines this as or helps categorize this as an American standard in a way. And it was, in a lot of ways, it wasn't a particularly nice person. He categorized, in this respect, European modernists as being effeminate. And I need to find this quote. I talked about it in my class last semester, and I couldn't find it. I still can't find it. But it's this quote where he says something along the lines of, he describes European modernists or American artists who are painting in those European modern styles as being something like prancing fairies who wear women's underwear, right? I mean, it's really rude. But this idea of it being effeminate as opposed to this, intense, rugged, American, masculine, attitude is really significant. And I emphasize it because when we look at the abstract expressionists in the 1940s, they're all these big, rugged, masculine, American men, and those myths are really being perpetuated. So these ideas from Benton kind of have some long, lasting influences. The other thing about Benton, too, and this is true for Benton, but it's true for what we see happening in the 1930s because of these WPA programs. A lot of the paintings that are being commissioned are for big public spaces, and they're big paintings. They're mural-sized paintings. A number of artists that we're going to talk about in the 1940s, probably Jackson Pollock, most famously, also worked for the WPA programs, and they worked on mural projects. And Pollock, in particular, worked with Benton. He studied with Benton. And when we talk about Pollock specifically, we'll look at some of the work that he was producing during this time period. So these artists in the 40s are having experience as very young artists or students in a lot of ways in the 1930s, and they're working big, and they're working on mural-sized paintings. And that's something to kind of file away as well, because when we look at abstract expressionism, as it develops in the 40s, one of the things that's really notable about it is it's big. It's painting, it's easel painting, but on the scale of murals in some cases. So this is another way where we're seeing these influences. Benton is also often talked about as being a regionalist artist or an American scene painter. Those two terms tend to get used somewhat interchangeably. Another good example of an American regionalist or a scene painter that really defines the trends of the time period is Grant Wood. Wood was raised, pretty much spent almost the entirety of his life in Iowa, so in Middle America, or what we think of as the Midwest. And his work reflects the place where he lives. And so that's something that's also really typical of American trends during this time period, that artists are kind of showing viewers, in a sense, or showing whoever's looking at or buying their paintings, the places where they live. So when we look at Grant Wood's work, we tend to associate it with Iowa specifically, but the Midwest in general. Probably Wood's best known painting is American Gothic. There's even kind of there's a whole mythos sort of around this painting as well. But I also included this other painting because he does a large number of landscapes, such as this one here called Young Corn. But you can see there's this trend that you see in American Gothic if you look at it closely, and you can see it a little more clearly in Young Corn, that there's a high degree of naturalism and realism. He's really paying attention to all the details and rendering minute details. But at the same time, the forms are kind of simplified and abstracted, but not nearly, to the extent that we see that's more characteristic in terms of European or European style modernism. So, for example, with both of these, even with American Gothic, if you look in the background and you look at the way he depicts the trees, they're like these round, almost perfectly round puffballs. When you look at the landscape of Young Corn, you have these, corn plants that are planted, exactly, perfectly, these rounded, hills. But again, when you look at the trees, trees just don't really look like that. We read it, immediately as trees in the landscape. The more you look at it, the more stylized it becomes. The one thing to keep in mind too, and this is also, looking beyond the war, is that this style of painting, so Benton style or Woodstock, and I think of it as American regionalism or American scene painting, this kind of painting in which it's very naturalistic in nature, becomes associated with Nazi art and also with Soviet, what's referred to as Soviet social realism. I'll spell that for you, or as a reminder. So we've got Soviet socialism. Oops. Yeah, we put Soviet socialist art, and we can also talk about National Socialist art. Or Nazi for short. So the two paintings that we're looking at on the right-hand side of the painting were paintings by German artists who were considered by the Nazi government to be among the best German artists. So on one hand, you've got the German government who's saying, these modernist artists, are degenerate artists, and they represent, all of the things that the Nazi Party was against, and they're the works and the artists who are being repressed and oppressed by the government. And that these two paintings on the right are the kinds of works that the government supported. So whether it was through commissions, for paintings for public spaces, or inclusion, there was the Nazi government held annual exhibitions like the Paris Salons, essentially, that were, I'm trying to remember the title of it. I think it was I think they were all called the Great German Art Exhibition. So it'd be Great German Art Exhibition of whatever year. It kind of like the way biennials function today. And this is the kind of work that you would find, in those exhibitions. You didn't see German expressionist work in it, or Berlin Dada work and things like that. You saw this very naturalistic work. So the reason I mention this is that as we get to the other side of World War II, and we look at art in the 1940s, art that looks like this gets associated with totalitarian governments. So it's specifically the Soviet government and Nazi Germany. And it's one of the reasons why, certainly a lot of different reasons, but it's one of the reasons why art so strongly and so quickly in the 1940s goes toward abstraction and is much less representational than it was, before the war. Because work that looked like this, it made people feel uncomfortable, pretty much in Western Europe and America. It evoked that past. So again, this time frame, so the early 1940s, so 1940 to 45. World War II breaks out. It's an active conflict, keeping in mind that tensions are mounting and developing through the 1930s as we come into the late 1930s. And you don't necessarily see a lot of stylistic development that's happening during this time period. So, like everything else, there's all this, effort toward supporting the war. Lots of artists are, as I mentioned this last time too, lots of artists are either, serving in the military capacities, or they're functioning as artists or designers. They're using their skills. And working for the government. So in one way or the other, everybody, certainly is involved in the war. And so it's not until we get after 1945 that we begin to see it, and notably, it's abstract expressionism develops really rapidly during this kind of short period of time. The war is done. People, in a sense, can move forward. But one thing I think that is also really important to talk about is, and it comes back to this idea of why this shift away from representation toward so much abstraction. And it also has a lot to do with not just the horrors of the war itself in terms of the military conflict, but it also has to do with the Holocaust and an increasing and pretty quickly developing understanding of the Nazi Holocaust. This is a quote from a poet by the name of Theodor Adorno, and he's really speaking about poetry But I think it's appropriate to talk about it more broadly than that, because oftentimes, poetry and literature and music and theater, we all think of them, and art and we think of the fine arts, we think of them collectively as the creative arts or creative expression. And one of the things that he said when he made this comment, and that was to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. Which I think is a really powerful statement. And if you think of this in reference to, fine art and this tradition in the West of painting, it's so heavily embedded in representation, even though we do see this movement toward, abstraction and toward non-representation developing in the first half of the 20th century. So much of art, even still, is about representing the world, representing places, people, things, and so on. And so I think it's important to consider the effect of the Holocaust and the kinds of images that people are seeing. One of the things about these images is that on one hand, I'm somewhat adverse to showing them because I worry about it being like Holocaust porn in a way that we're really kind of pandering to looking at these terrible images. But at the same time, I think it's important to remember, and certainly we weren't alive at that time, so we don't remember. But it's important to remember these events and to really understand. And also, in our time, in our lifetimes, we've probably read books about this topic, or seen films about it, or we know about it. We've studied it in school, and so I worry sometimes we can become a little desensitized to that as well. And you have to imagine that in the mid-late 1940s, as people are understanding more fully what happened during the Holocaust, it's incredibly shocking. The scope of the Holocaust in particular, millions and millions of people in concentration camps and work camps, dying in those conditions, basically being starved and worked to death, or just outright, eliminated. In terms of talking about a genocide of, not just a whole group of people in terms of Jews, but also other people who were considered undesirable. More leftist thinkers, homosexuals, people who we would think of today, mental illness or any kind of handicap, mental or physical as well. So these are two photographs that were taken by the U.S. Armed Forces. They are survivors of the Buchenwald and Vöbeln concentration camps, and these were taken just a few days after liberation in April. And at the time period, nobody really understood how extensive these camps were, and I think these are really powerful images. I'm curious how many of you may have read anything by Elie Wiesel. Has anybody read Night? Is probably specific. Have you seen this, or have you come across this photograph before? Elie Wiesel is in this photograph. He's this face you see peering through here. This is him. And he survived. It's really a powerful book. If you've read that, do you want to talk about that at all? Did your experience of reading Night? It's a rough read, I think, in a lot of ways.
It's actually a trio of 3 books, and they're all like that.
Oh yeah, that's true. I forget about that too. It's not just a standalone book.
They're horrifying, but at the same time, they're beautiful in the fact that he's come through all that, and he has the strength to relive it and to let the world know about it.
Yeah, and he talks about, I don't know if he talks about it in Night in particular, because it's been a long time since I have read it, but it definitely outside of the book as well, he talks about like the guilt of being a survivor in a lot of ways. And so writing this book is I think part of his emotionally dealing with the situation, because so many people, including his father, did not survive. But it's also a kind of testimony or a testament. He's a person who went through this experience, and he's telling this, certainly telling the story firsthand. So one of the things about people who survived the camps is that in terms of torture and starvation is we see these images of emaciated bodies, or if you read, stories or hear stories of survivors, they're talking about these horrific conditions. And so one thing to keep in mind if we think about, the visual tradition or what's happening, with art in the first half of the century, and I just kind of put these images together. This is a self-portrait by Egon Schiele. This is Oskar Kokoschka's portrait of Adolf Loos, and a self-portrait by Picasso here. The trends in figurative art in the first half of the century, up until World War I, are abstraction of the figure, but distorting the figure. So there's we see, and I think Egon Schiele is probably a really good example, but you've got people like, Picasso, who's flattening forms and distorting forms. Both Kokoschka and Schiele are considered to be expressionists, a Viennese expressionist and a German expressionist. But there's this kind of distortion to the figure that after, understanding the Holocaust and understanding what happened to people to the Holocaust, I think is much less comfortable. Because you've gone from, visually distorting the figure or distorting the figure in an aesthetic way to the reality of it and to the horror of it when it's real. And so, and that's one of the reasons why, again, there's lots of reasons, but it's part of the reasoning in the 1940s. There's such a very quick and very strong move away from working with the figure, and especially with a distorted figure. So if you look, and again, this is just kind of a brief overview, and we'll talk about these works in more detail over the next few class meetings. When you look at some of the work that's quick to develop in the 1940s, it looks like this. Right? So we've got works here by Hans Hofmann and Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko. And certainly they're reflective of lots of other ideas and issues and trends developing in the art, but notably they're not figurative, right? And they're not dealing with the real world in that respect, or especially images of the figure. So again, lots of different reasons why these changes happening, but I think it's important to certainly to consider the Holocaust and the reality of the Holocaust and kind of the trauma, I guess, is maybe one way of thinking about it as well. This work here, we'll look at this in a moment. This work here is by Hans Hofmann, and as I mentioned before, one of the things that happens, during the 1930s is so many German artists, scholars, thinkers, in some cases scientists as well as just average people, certainly just then people who we don't necessarily are household names. So many people are trying to escape Europe, and there are a really broad number of artists and architects too who come to the United States. They also go to other places around the world, but a lot of them come into the United States as refugees, and they become really significant. As when we talk about architecture, one of the architects we'll talk about is Mies van der Rohe, who really revolutionizes architecture in the United States, but eventually also on a global level. And he's an architect who leaves Germany and comes to the United States. A really important artist who leaves Germany and comes to the United States in the 1930s is Hans Hofmann. And Hofmann, when you look at his career, he certainly had skills in rendering the figure in space and so on. But he becomes really interested in non-representational abstract art. And this is a quote from him, and I think this is a really interesting quote. The photograph on the right is taken in the 1950s, and it was he taught art classes in New York. He said in 1936 he set up, was part of one of the founding members of an organization called American Abstract Artists, so they're kind of promoting this idea of abstraction. Notably, I think it's interesting, you see in the studio, they're still drawing from the figure, working with the figure, but in an abstract way. But this is one of the things that Hans Hofmann says. He says it makes no difference whether a work is naturalistic or abstract. Every visual expression follows the same fundamental laws. So, and that was generally the way he taught, was that if all artists should and probably do have a basic skill set, and what you do in the end really doesn't matter, whether creating representational images or abstract images. And he was really, in a lot of ways, trying to find correspondences between the two. How do you take traditional training in the arts and push it toward abstraction? I'm curious, how many of you last semester worked on the Virginia Barnes exhibit? Some of you did. Is Hans Hoffman a name that's familiar to you from that? Did you guys do research? Because I know that Virginia Barnes took, because I'm a little bit unclear, she took classes with him, is that correct?
I was
Somebody
under the
remember?
understanding that she studied under him,
Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah, so if you're in, and this is where you see his huge influence, because he influences so many artists because he's in New York City, and especially as we talk about, these artists and styles coming out of New York in the 40s, and actually many generations, he's an enormous influence. Certainly he's important as an artist in his own right, but he's also teaching lots of people, including Virginia Barnes, who was instructor, professor of art here in the art department, and there's an exhibit of her work in the library. Has everybody seen the work in the library? Hopefully, if you haven't, you should definitely pay attention to it. What's that? Yeah, every day. Yeah, you get to see it every day. I hope you enjoy it because you do get to see it every day. But that work is also a good example of these trends from the 1940s. Although, remind me of the dates on a lot of the works. They kind of range, don't they, from through the 80s? I think. What is some of the earliest work? Do you remember? Does it go 60s? So probably not much before the 60s. But anyway, there's this kind of lingering influence. So one of the things about Hoffman, what he's often associated with, certainly is work like this. This is created right near the end of the war. It's what we would think of today. The term at this point really hasn't been coined yet, but it's what we would think of today as action painting. Where what you're seeing is the record of the artist's action, right? So it's a kind of painting that doesn't represent anything. You don't look at this and think, well, that looks like a table and a chair and a person or a landscape. But you're seeing this mark making, but there's a sense of energy behind it. Certainly Kandinsky earlier in the century is an influence on this kind of thinking or way of thinking about making art. But what Hoffman is really notable for is, this is a little bit later work, and this is especially where he comes into his own as a teacher and sort of having his own really personal significant idea, is he develops this idea of what he calls the push-pull theory of art. And this is where he's thinking about art traditionally and how you can expand it into a more abstract way of thinking about art. When you look at this work here from the late 1950s, it's called The Gate. And when you think of a gate, you think of something concrete, like a garden gate or a portal or something like that. Look at this image and it's certainly non-representational. But if you look carefully, you can see essentially there are these blocks of colors, and he was interested in how some colors tend to recede and some colors tend to come forward. The German artist Joseph Albers was also interested in this as well. So Albers' homage to the Square series, which we'll talk about, not today, but we'll talk about in the not too distant future, was also interested in really similar ideas as how colors function, how shape and color function, how we perceive it. For Hoffman, what he was interested in here, he talks about this idea of the push-pull theory, that even though you're looking at painting, which is essentially flat, right? It's not a depiction of three-dimensional space. We still look at it and we think about three-dimensional space. We think about these colors kind of floating in a field or floating in space. And in this respect, he was thinking about linear perspective, right? The tradition, in particular, the traditions of linear perspective. That in a traditional sense, and this is again way artists are taught generally at the foundational level, and then where they go with it, sort of the sky's the limit in a way. But part of the foundations of art in the Western tradition, certainly going back to the Renaissance, is that you learn how to create or render forms to create the appearance of three dimensions, right? So you have a horizon line and a vanishing point. You create these representations of things to create the illusion that some things are closer to you and some things are further away, that they exist within three-dimensional space. So what Hoffman became really intrigued by was how do you do that in an abstract way? So how do you create a sense of space that's not representational? And that's essentially what he referred to as this push-pull dynamic. And you see this in his work, and you see it in, certainly not all artists' work in this time period, but a lot of artists' work. And what it does is it's a visual tension which makes the images more interesting. It kind of holds your attention. So I think that's one way of thinking about it or considering it. In a sense that in a number of different ways, the stage is really set, for the I'm setting the stage, I should say, for this explosion of a new style, that's going to happen after the war. Keeping in mind as we talk about the artists, we'll talk about the work that they do in the 30s and early 40s, and then get to this time frame of the mid and late 1940s. So they're responding, artists are responding to developments in art in the 1930s. In some cases, taking ideas like painting big, on the scale of a mural. But they're also reacting against that art by, wanting to work in more abstract ways. So there's lots of things, that are influencing them. Two really huge influences on the artists themselves, but maybe more importantly, how artwork is being perceived in the 1940s, is coming from two critics by the name of Clement Greenberg and Harold Rosenberg. And again, they're both, their careers are starting in the 1930s, but they're really significant art critics within this time period. They're both, writing for magazines and art magazines, newspapers and so on. And one way of thinking about, especially Greenberg and Rosenberg, is they become a kind of liaison in a way, and they become a kind of liaison between the artist and museums, artists and galleries, artists and patrons, people who are buying art, but also artists and the public as well. Because they're writing about art, they're influencing, the way people think about art. And both Greenberg and Rosenberg strongly, or rather felt really strongly that abstract art was the best art of its time, of their time, or of this, contemporary present in the 1940s. And they really pushed a lot of ideas, ideas about this in their writing, but also certainly in talking to people too. I want to read just a few excerpts from a book called The Painted Word. Again, those of you who were in Art 307, we read this at the beginning of the, or not, rather, well, at the beginning, the end, whatever it was, we've read this entire book. But there's some good segments here. One of the things about the writer, Tom Wolfe, is that the way that he writes and the language in which he writes, it tends it to be very kind of lively. One thing about Tom Wolfe is he's an outsider, and the book The Painted Word, I think, is a great book. Obviously, it's a little book, it's a quick read. And it was published in the early 1970s, and it was basically him trying to understand what happened in art from the time frame of abstract expressionism to the time in which he was writing it in the early 70s. So he offers this kind of outsider's view of the art world, which is pretty interesting. So this is where he's talking about, and we'll come up on talking about Greenberg and Rosenberg, and I like how he explains their ideas and their influences. So this part here, where I'm going to begin is where he's talking about the development of the New York School, which are the abstract expressionists. He uses this term Cynocla, and Cynocla, when you hear me say that, one way of thinking about it, one way to translate it, is circle. So he's using a French word, Cynocla, so think circle there. And again, he likes to play with language. So he says all these circles and coteries came together after the war as the Cynocla de Cynocla, right? The circle of circles. The New York School, or the 10th Street School, the creators of abstract expressionism. Most of these people had slogged their way through the Depression with great difficulty, and their mood tended toward bohemianism of the high seriousness vein. Two of their main meeting places, the subjects of the artist school and the club, were on East 8th Street, and the other, the Cedar Tavern, that's one we talked about last time, was on University Place. But the galleries that showed their work, such as the Area and the Hilda Carmel, were on 10th Street, and that was the name that caught on. Within Le Monde, and he likes to use this phrase Le Monde too, Le Monde technically, and he's kind of using it with mock seriousness. Le Monde in French means the world, but the way he uses it in here is he's talking about the art world, right? So the people who are in the know. So he says, within Le Monde, going down to 10th Street was like a Saturday pilgrimage down to Soho today. But this is in the early 70s, so today it would be more like going to Chelsea, which is where all the hot art galleries are. In any event, the Cenacle was soon so big and so influential that the regular Friday night meetings at the club became like town meetings for the entire New York art scene, attracting dealers, collectors, uptown curators like Alfred Barr, who was also curator at, or was a curator rather, at MoMA, critics, like these two guys, and just about any other culturati who could wrangle their way in. The great theorists to come out of this Cenacle de Cenacle were Clement Greenberg and Harold Rosenberg. Both had been involved in the lower Manhattan literary politics of the 1930s, and then they became more and more purely theorists, critics, and aestheticians in the 1940s. More to the point, both of them had been friends of various abstract artists even during the Freeze. Greenberg had been a regular in the Hoffman Cenacle, and it was essentially Hoffman's ideas and Hoffman's emphasis on purity, purity, purity that were about to sweep Kulturberg via Greenberg. And we talk about Kulturberg, somewhat kind of culture in general. One secret of Greenberg's and Rosenberg's astounding success then was that they were not like uptown critics. They were not mere critics. They spoke as the voice of Bohemia, and naturally Le Monde listened. To describe this, the well-placed platform they spoke from is not to downgrade the two men's particular genius. Greenberg, in particular, radiated a sense of absolute authority. He was not a very prepossessing individual at first glance. He spoke in fits and starts one minute and drawls the next, but somehow one couldn't help but pay attention. Likewise, his prose style. He would never veer from the most skull-crushing Göttingen scholar tautologies, and these are in quotation marks, essences and purities and opticalities and formal factors and logics of readjustment and God knows what else. To cries of despair and outrage that would have embarrassed Shelley, right, the Romantic poet. In a famous essay in Horizon in 1947, he said, "The entire future of art in America was in the hands of 50 brave but anonymous and beleaguered artists south of 34th Street who were about to be wiped out at any moment," right? So that's really kind of passionate stuff. By whom? By what? Why? By the dull horror of American life. Their isolation, and this is a quote, "Their isolation is inconceivably crushing, unbroken, damning," unquote, said Greenberg. That anyone can produce art on a respectable level in this situation is highly improbable. What can 50 do against 140 million? So one of the things that Greenberg was doing and setting up in his writing was the fact that this group of artists, we think of as the abstract expressionists, this like poor, beleaguered, group of artists don't have much money, don't have many resources, that they are the essence, right, or the soul of American art. And keeping in mind that in this time frame, nobody, really knows who these artists are. They're just really beginning, really beginning to get attention. They're being represented in some galleries. None of them have had any significant museum shows, and there's really not much being written about them outside of reviews of exhibitions. And so I'll skip a little bit here. And then Wolf says that when Greenberg spoke, it was not as if merely the future of artworks were at stake, but the very quality, the very possibility of civilization in America. His fury seemed to come out of an implacable insistence on purity. He saw modernism as headed toward a certain inevitable conclusion, though through its own internal logic, just as Marxists saw Western society as heading irrevocably toward the dictatorship of the proletariat and ensuing nirvana. In Greenberg's eyes, the freight train of art history had a specific destination. He called for self-criticism and self-definition with a vengeance, he said. It was time to clear the tracks at last of all the remaining rubble of pre-modern way of painting. And just what was this destination? On this point, Greenberg couldn't have been clearer: flatness. The general theory went as follows. As the Cubists and other early modernists had correctly realized, a painting was not a window through which one could peer into the distance. Now we could kind of jump back to Hoffman here. Through which one could peer into the distance. The three-dimensional effects were sheer illusion. A painting was a flat surface with paint on it. Earlier abstract artists had understood the importance of flatness in the simple sense of painting in two dimensions, but they hadn't known how to go beyond that. They still used paint in such a way that it divided neatly into lines, forms, contours, colors, just as it had in pre-modern days. What it needed was purity, a style in which lines, forms, contours, colors all became unified on a flat surface. This business of flatness became quite an issue, an obsession, one might say. The question of what an artist could or could not do without violating the principle of flatness, the integrity of the picture plane, as it became known. And that's a good phrase to know, the integrity of the picture plane, right? And what that's about is that painting isn't about representation. It isn't about the illusion of three dimensions. It's about a two-dimensional surface, right? It inspired such subtle distinctions, such exquisitely miniaturized hypotheses, such stereotactic microelectrode needle implant hostilities. I love the way he writes. Such brilliant, if ever decreasing, tighter turning spirals of logic that it compares admirably with the most famous of all questions that remain from the debates of the scholastics. You know, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? So he's talking about how lofty, in a sense, these ideas are becoming. So he says most of the theory up to 1950 was Greenbergian in origin. Enter Rosenberg. So this is where Rosenberg comes into play. Rosenberg came up with a higher synthesis, a theory that combined Greenberg's formal purity with something that had been lacking in abstract art from the early synthetic Cubist days and ever since, namely the emotional wallop of the old realistic pre-modern pictures. This was a question that had troubled Picasso through the 1930s. Any return to realism was, of course, out. But Rosenberg had a solution: action painting. And that became the single most famous phrase of the period, a fact that did not please Greenberg, right? Because Greenberg, was really on board, with what becomes defined as action painting a little before Rosenberg, but Rosenberg's term becomes the one that sticks. And here's a quote. This is from Rosenberg. At a certain moment, the canvas begins to appear to one American painter after another as an arena in which to act, right? So the painting isn't a representation of something anymore. It's a place where you act. And so that, and the painting, in a sense, becomes a kind of document of the artist's actions. So that, said Rosenberg. What was to go on the canvas was not a picture, but an event. And so that's a deep kind of sea change in what painting is all about. The vision that Rosenberg inspired caught the public imagination for a time, as well as that of more painters, both professional and amateur, than one is likely to want to recall. It was an action painter, a Promethean artist gorged with emotion and overloaded with paint, hurling himself and his brushes at the canvas as if in hand-to-hand combat with fate. There, in those furious sweeps of the brush on canvas, in those splatters of unchained id, right, reference to Freud, one could see that the artist's emotion itself still alive in the finished product. And see, all that picture plane integrity a reasonable man could ask for in lines that are forms, and forms that are colors, and colors that are both. So what Greenberg and Rosenberg were doing essentially was really promoting these trends in art. And because they had connections. That's why I refer to them as kind of liaisons in a lot of ways, because they were the connectors between artists, between curators, between collectors, or patrons, however you want to think of it. They really helped to drive the popularity of abstract expressionism. One of the things that Tom Wolfe talks about in the book is how abstract expressionism wasn't really particularly commercially viable, that there weren't really large numbers of patrons who were buying abstract expressionist paintings through the 1940s and early 50s, but museums were, and certain collectors were. People like Peggy Guggenheim, kind of this, were in this, this kind of high, elite, category of collectors. And there were also artists who were getting a lot of press, certainly, by, these critics, but, big magazines like Time Life and so on, were beginning to, run stories about these, kind of young, new, American artists. So I think it's important to, in some ways, to question, well, why do we talk about these artists as being, so significant? We've got time, we've got time in which to be reflective, and it's important to understand what all of these, different dynamics are. And the role of the critic in this time period is really, really specific. Something that's getting talked about a lot now is, are art critics really critics? Are they really functioning as critics? Are they really just, promoters, of artists? Are they really working, kind of hand in hand with curators? And that's working, and that critique is based on an idea that critics are separate from the system, in ways that they're outside, of all of these dynamics. But I think, in large part, in reality, critics are a part of that dynamic, and they kind of always have been. And I think that when you look at Greenberg and Rosenberg, you really see that at play, that they have this belief in what is the best art, and it's work that's abstract, doesn't represent anything in the real world, but it also is very dynamic as well. In fact, one of the things that Greenberg talked about really powerfully was how abstract expressionist painting didn't have subject matter, but it did have content. And the content was how you responded to the work, or how you understood the work, or how you read the work. So I think it's important to talk about these critics as much as the artists themselves, because they're helping to create a place for this art to exist, or designing a place in a lot of ways as well. So we're up just about out of time, just like another minute or less left. We come back on Friday, we'll really begin to talk properly about abstract expression. We've been kind of talking around the edges of it and kind of setting the stage. And we come back on Friday, we'll start looking at abstract expressionist artists. And the first one we'll talk about is somebody who often is overshadowed by all of the male abstract expressionists. So we'll start a discussion of abstract expressionism with Lee Krasner when we come back on Friday.